Believing they were simply adopting a pet, an alien crew pulled a fragile, fleshy curiosity from the smoking wreckage of a drifting transport ship on the edge of the Orion Spur. They didn't know about human adrenaline. They didn't understand our evolutionary history of apex predation or our terrifying capacity for calculated malice. By the time the Galactic High Council realized their mistake, it was too late. The shivering toddler they named Leo hadn't just survived their brutal, war-torn homeworld, he had conquered it. This is the classified history of Sector 4's collapse and the rise of the galaxy's most ruthless human. The void of space is entirely devoid of morality. It preserves the innocent and the guilty with the same freezing indifference. When the planetary dreadnought Vanguard dropped out of faster-than-light travel in the uncharted fringes of Sector 4, its sensors immediately picked up a ghost. It was a massive, scarred hunk of twisted metal, venting crystallized oxygen and spinning slowly in the dark. For the sake of human records, the alien commander's unpronounceable phonetic clicks and subsonic hums have been translated to their closest cultural equivalents. Commander Garrison stood on the bridge of the Vanguard, his 4 amber eyes narrowing as he assessed the derelict ship. Garrison belonged to the Archon, a towering, militaristic species characterized by dense, biometallic exoskeletons, rigid honor codes, and a complete lack of empathy for weaker species. Life signs? Garrison's voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the deck plates. "Negative, Commander," replied his chief science officer, a sycophantic Archon whose translated designation was Winston. The vessel's atmospheric scrubbers failed weeks ago. Hull breaches on multiple decks. The radiation shielding is completely stripped. Whatever was inside was cooked by cosmic rays or frozen in the vacuum. Scavenger protocols dictate we strip the reactor and move on. "Send a boarding party," Garrison ordered, ignoring Winston's assessment. The architecture is unfamiliar. It does not match the Krieger aesthetic, nor the Synthetica. Look at the hull plating. It relies on kinetic absorption rather than energy shielding. Primitive, yet entirely practical. 30 minutes later, Garrison found himself stepping through the shattered airlock of the human colony ship, the USG Bradbury. Gravity was offline. Floating droplets of frozen blood caught the beams of the Archon soldiers' shoulder-mounted lumen casters. The corridors were littered with the dead-soft unarmored bipeds, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. Garrison inspected a corpse. To his species, these creatures looked absurdly vulnerable. No dermal plating, no secondary respiratory systems, just soft flesh draped over a fragile calcium frame. Yet, as his squad pushed deeper into the ship, they found piles of dead raiders, Krieger pirates, heavily armed and armored surrounding the soft-fleshed defenders. These weak creatures had fought like cornered demons, using mining lasers, sharpened maintenance tools, and eventually their bare, fleshy hands. They breached the main habitation deck. It was here that Garrison found the vault. It was a reinforced panic room, the only area of the ship still drawing auxiliary power. "Blow the hinges," Garrison commanded. The thermal charges melted the thick steel like wax. As the heavy door groaned inward, Garrison raised his plasma rifle, expecting a final, desperate ambush. Instead, he found only 2 adults. A man, Raymond Hayes, according to the identification tag, pinned to his blood-soaked jacket, and a woman. Both were dead, having succumbed to a combination of plasma burns and asphyxiation. But their bodies were deliberately draped over a pressurized, lead-lined cryogenic pod. They had used their own flesh as a final radiation shield. Winston approached, his mandibles clicking in disgust. Pathetic. They died protecting a piece of cargo. Garrison brushed the bodies aside with terrifying ease and wiped the frost from the pod's glass viewport. Inside, wrapped in a synthetic thermal blanket, was a male child. No more than 3 Earth years old. The boy was awake. He wasn't crying. His wide, dark eyes locked onto Garrison's terrifying alien visage through the glass. There was no fear in those eyes, only a cold, absolute observation. "It's a biological curiosity," Winston sneered, raising his scanner. "We should transport it to the capital's vivisection labs. The High Council will pay handsomely to understand how such a pitiful species achieved interstellar travel." Garrison looked at the dead parents. He looked at the Krieger corpses lining the hallway. Then, he looked back at the child. The Archon culture worshipped strength, but more than that, they worshipped the will to survive. This child was the apex of that will, the lone survivor of a massacre, paid for in the blood of its creators. No, Garrison said, his voice echoing in the dead chamber. The child comes with me. Commander, that is a violation of quarantine protocol, Winston objected, taking a step forward. Garrison pivoted, moving with a blinding speed that defied his massive bulk. His armored hand wrapped around Winston's throat, lifting the science officer a foot off the deck. I claim the right of spoils. This creature is mine. You will falsify the logs, Winston. You will report that the ship was entirely devoid of biologicals. If you speak a word of this to the High Council, I will tear your mandibles from your skull and feed them to the scavengers. Do we understand each other? Winston choked, tapping frantically on Garrison's wrist. Garrison dropped him. The commander punched the release code on the cryopod. The hiss of equalizing pressure filled the room. Garrison reached in with his massive, four-fingered hand. The tiny human didn't shrink away. Instead, the toddler reached out, his small, soft fingers wrapping around Garrison's armored thumb. I will call you Leo, Garrison muttered. The Archon homeworld of Prime was a crucible designed to forge living weapons. The gravity was roughly 1.5 times that of Earth. The atmosphere was thick, heavy, and perpetually choked with the smog of industry and war. For a human child, merely existing on Prime was a Herculean trial. In the sprawling, brutalist stone estate of Commander Garrison, Leo grew up in a world of constant, agonizing pain. By the age of 6, his bones were microfracturing and healing at a rapid rate, forcing his skeletal structure to become incredibly dense. His muscles were constantly tearing and rebuilding, adapting to the crushing weight of the planet. Garrison's wife, Isabella, an aristocratic Archon with a mind as sharp as a diamond scalpel, initially viewed Leo as a grotesque pet. She found his soft skin revolting and his constant need for thermal regulation exhausting. But humans have a unique evolutionary trait: extreme sociability and the psychological mirroring of their environment. Leo quickly learned to mimic Archon body language. He suppressed his tears. He learned the exact posture of submission and the rigid stance of defiance. By the time Leo was 10, the physical differences between him and the Archon youths were glaringly obvious. Archon children already had a thick layer of chitinous armor. Leo only had skin. They had claws. Leo had blunt nails. They had natural weapons. Leo had nothing. But Leo had a human brain, and more importantly, he had human adrenaline. The Archons were cold-blooded, methodical, and possessed immense static strength. They did not experience the biological overdrive that a human did when pushed into a corner. The turning point came during the Festival of the Hunt, a traditional Archon coming-of-age ceremony. Leo, now 12, was enrolled in the elite military prep academy due to Garrison's influence. The other cadets despised him. He was the flesh thing, an anomaly that insulted their pure-blooded superiority. The ringleader of his tormentors was a massive, cruel youth named Conrad, the eldest son of Senator Sterling Garrison's chief political rival. Senator Sterling had long suspected Garrison was harboring an illegal alien, but he had no proof, as Leo was legally registered as a heavily mutated Archon subspecies from a distant colony. One afternoon, Conrad cornered Leo in the Academy's lower maintenance levels. Conrad was accompanied by 3 others. "Look at it," Conrad hissed, his mandibles flaring in a show of dominance. "No armor, no claws. You bruise if the wind blows too hard, flesh thing. My father says you are a sickness in Garrison's house. Today we cure the sickness." Leo didn't back away. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on Conrad. He was smaller, severely outmatched in weight and strength. But Leo had been mapping the maintenance levels for weeks. He knew the layout of every high-voltage conduit, every steam vent, and every structural weakness. He knew he couldn't beat an Archon in a fistfight. So, he didn't try. "You're standing on a localized grav plate," Leo said, his voice eerily calm, speaking perfect, unaccented Archon dialect. "It's used to load heavy cargo. The insulation on the primary power cell beneath it is frayed." Conrad laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Are you begging for your life with maintenance trivia?" "No," Leo said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metallic object. It was a compressed hydro flask he had stolen from the mess hall. "I'm explaining the physics of your death." Before Conrad could react, Leo threw the flask hard against the stone wall directly above the grav plate. The flask shattered, raining a sheet of water down onto the metal grating where Conrad and his enforcers stood. At the exact same second, Leo slammed his heel into the manual override switch for the grav plate's power feed. The frayed conduit sparked. The water acted as a perfect conductor. A massive surge of raw, unshielded electricity ripped through the grating. The three lackeys were thrown backward, convulsing as their nervous systems overloaded. Conrad, standing directly over the fault, took the brunt of the shock. His exoskeleton, highly conductive due to its metallic properties, superheated. Conrad screamed, a horrific, unnatural sound, before collapsing to the floor, twitching and smoking. Leo walked over to the paralyzed, agonizingly conscious Conrad. He didn't gloat, he didn't smile. He simply crouched down, retrieved a heavy metal wrench from a nearby tool rack, and systematically shattered Conrad's right knee joint, the only part of an Archon's leg where the armor is thin enough to break. "Next time you corner me," Leo whispered into Conrad's ear, "I won't use the environment. I'll just find you while you sleep." The ensuing tribunal was a political nightmare. Senator Sterling demanded Leo's immediate execution. Garrison stood before the High Council, his presence casting a long, dark shadow over the chamber. The boy was attacked by four larger opponents, Garrison argued, his voice a dangerous rumble. Archon law, strictly delineated in the Codex of Strife, explicitly states that survival against overwhelming odds by any tactical means necessary is not only legal, it is the highest form of honor. My son neutralized a superior force. He did not break the law. He embodied it. The High Council, bound by their own rigid traditions, had no choice but to acquit Leo. However, a seed of terror had been planted. The instructors at the academy stopped viewing Leo as a frail curiosity. They realized what Garrison already knew. Without armor, without claws, the human relied entirely on his intellect and his ruthlessness. He was a predator of a different order. Back at the estate, Garrison found Leo in the armory, dismantling and reassembling a pulse rifle blindfolded. "You crippled the senator's son," Garrison said. "He will never walk without a mechanical brace." "He intended to kill me," Leo replied, not stopping his work. "I left him alive to serve as a messenger. Fear is a highly effective deterrent, Father." Garrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He realized that in his attempt to raise a survivor, he had forged a sociopath. Leo had stripped away all the softer aspects of human nature, empathy, mercy, hesitation, and replaced them with the cold, calculating brutality of Archon society. But he retained the human capacity for innovation and spite. It was a terrifying combination. By his 18th cycle, Leo was a junior lieutenant in the Archon Vanguard. He had grown to a towering 6 feet 4 inches, unusually tall for a human, a direct result of adapting to Prime's gravity. His muscles were like coiled steel wire, dense and heavy. His face was a map of pale scars, hard lines, and cold, calculating eyes. He was universally hated by his peers, and universally feared by his subordinates. The Archon Empire was currently entrenched in a brutal border war with the Synthetica, a collective of cybernetic organisms that operated with terrifying hive mind efficiency. The war was going poorly. The Archons relied on individual heroism, brute strength, and rigid battlefield formations. The Synthetica relied on mathematical precision and relentless attrition. Leo was assigned to the 404th Infantry Battalion, a penal legion composed of disgraced soldiers, political dissidents, and outcasts. It was an open secret within the military high command that Senator Sterling, now the Minister of Defense, had personally arranged the assignment. The 404th was slated for deployment to Oakhaven, a frozen, tactically useless rock on the very edge of the Synthetica border. It was a suicide mission. The Synthetica were massing an invasion fleet, and the 404th was meant to be the speed bump that bought the main Archon fleet time to fortify the inner systems. "They expect us to die, Lieutenant," muttered Sergeant Kale, a grizzled, missing-an-eye Archon veteran whose armor was scarred from a dozen campaigns. They were huddled in a frozen trench on Oakhaven, the temperature hovering around -60 degrees. "Minister Sterling expects us to die," Leo corrected, adjusting the thermal optics on his rifle. "The Synthetica just expect us to be mathematically insignificant. We are going to disappoint them both." "How?" Kale asked bitterly. "We have 300 men. Scanners indicate a Synthetica Vanguard force of over 5,000 combat drones marching on our position. We have no orbital support. Our comms have been jammed. We are ghosts." "Good," Leo smiled. It was a rare, terrifying expression. If the ministry can't see us, they can't countermand my orders. Leo didn't order his men to hold the trench. Archon military doctrine dictated that retreating was cowardice, and one must meet the enemy head-on. Leo, unburdened by Archon honor, ordered an immediate, full-scale retreat into the jagged, ice-choked canyons of Oakhaven's northern hemisphere. His men nearly mutinied. "This is treason!" shouted a disgraced officer named Vane. "We are Archons! We do not run!" Leo walked up to Vane, drew his sidearm, and shot the officer in the kneecap. As Vane collapsed, screaming, Leo looked at the rest of the men. "You are not Archons right now. You are dead men. I am the only thing standing between you and the grave. Anyone else who wishes to die with honor may stay in this trench. The rest of you, move." They moved. Leo led them deep into a narrow, twisting canyon network, known as the Serpent's Throat. The Synthetica drones, operating on algorithms that prioritize the most direct route to the fleeing targets, pursued them into the chasm. "They're bottlenecking," Sergeant Cale reported, looking at the rear-view scanners. "But they'll overrun us in 20 minutes. We are backed against a sheer ice wall. There is no way out." "I know," Leo said calmly. He pulled a remote detonator from his tactical webbing. "I spent the last 48 hours mining the thermal vents beneath the canyon walls with highly unstable plasma charges." Cale's remaining eye widened in horror. "Lieutenant, if you detonate those charges, the seismic shockwave will trigger an avalanche of 1,000,000 tons of ice. It will crush the drones, yes, but it will crush us too. We are in the blast radius." "Not entirely," Leo said, checking his chronometer. "Humans have a concept, Sergeant. It's called the fatal funnel. We lure the enemy into a space where they cannot maneuver, and we eliminate them. As for the avalanche," Leo pointed to a specific sequence of shallow caves dotted along the base of the ice wall. "I mapped the structural integrity of this canyon. Those caves will hold. The ice will bridge over them. It will be dark, it will be cold, and we will be buried alive. But we will survive." The vanguard of the Synthetica army rounded the bend, a terrifying tide of chrome and red optics. Leo hit the detonator. The ground didn't just shake, it ruptured. The plasma charges superheated the subterranean thermal vents, causing a massive, pressurized explosion. The sheer walls of the canyon groaned, cracked, and then millions of tons of ancient, hardened ice sheared off. "Into the caves!" Leo roared over the deafening sound of the apocalypse. His men scrambled. Leo was the last one in, diving into the shallow alcove just as the sky went black. The noise was indescribable, a roaring, crushing weight that pressed against their eardrums until they bled. The ground violently shuddered for what felt like an eternity. Then, silence. A profound, suffocating silence. They were trapped in absolute darkness, buried under a mountain of ice. For 12 hours they sat in the freezing black. Panic began to set in among the Archon soldiers. Their biology was not built for confinement. "We are entombed," Cale whispered. "We are concealed," Leo corrected. He activated a small plasma cutter. "Start digging upward. A 30-degree angle. The ice is fractured. It will give way." It took them 2 days to dig out. When they finally broke through the surface, the sight that greeted them was staggering. The entire canyon was gone, replaced by a smooth, rolling plain of shattered ice. And sticking out of the ice, crushed and mangled, were the remains of 5,000 Synthetica drones. The enemy vanguard had been entirely wiped out. Leo didn't stop there. He led his surviving men, 280 of them, on a brutal 3-week march across the frozen tundra, bypassing the main Synthetica lines entirely. They survived on emergency rations and, when those ran out, they hunted the indigenous ice stalkers. Leo taught them human endurance. He taught them how to ignore the pain, how to channel their hatred into fuel. They emerged not at the Archon lines, but behind the Synthetica forward operating base. The enemy was entirely unprepared for an attack from the rear. Leo's Penal Legion fell upon the base like starving wolves. They didn't just win, they slaughtered the garrison, stole a Synthetica deep space transport, and flew it directly back to the Archon capital of Prime. When Leo walked onto the floor of the Ministry of Defense, holding the severed cybernetic head of the Synthetica theater commander, the room went dead silent. Minister Sterling looked as if he had seen a ghost. Mission accomplished, Minister, Leo said, tossing the dripping head onto the polished marble floor. The 404th reports 0 casualties from enemy fire. We are ready for our next assignment. Commander Garrison, watching from the gallery, felt a swell of dark, terrifying pride. He had raised a monster. But what Garrison didn't know, what no one in the Empire knew, was the secret Leo had uncovered while slicing into the Synthetica commander's memory banks during the flight home. The Synthetica didn't attack Sector 4 unprovoked. They were retaliating. And more importantly, Leo had finally accessed the unrestricted galactic archives. He found the classified file on the USG Bradbury. The human colony ship hadn't been destroyed by Krieger pirates. That was a cover story fabricated by Winston. The Bradbury had been targeted and crippled by a high-yield plasma torpedo, an Archon torpedo, ordered by none other than Minister Sterling himself, who had wanted to test the Empire's new weapons on an insignificant, fleshy target before the war began. Leo walked out of the ministry, the eyes of the elite locked onto his back. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a son of humanity, and humanity demanded vengeance. The Archon Empire thought they had forged the perfect weapon against their enemies. They didn't realize the weapon was pointed squarely at their own heads. Revenge, within the rigid framework of Archon culture, was an agonizingly formal affair. It required public declarations, ritualistic bloodletting, and heavily monitored duels in the obsidian amphitheaters of Prime. It was a loud, arrogant spectacle designed to preserve societal order and stroke aristocratic egos. Leo, however, possessed a mind uniquely sculpted by the grim, unyielding history of Earth. As he sliced deeper into the unrestricted archives using Synthetica decryption protocols, he didn't just uncover the truth about his parents. He downloaded the ancient, bloody texts of his own species. He spent weeks consuming the translations of Niccolo Machiavelli's treatises on ruthless pragmatism. He absorbed the mechanized slaughter detailed by Karl von Clausewitz and the psychological warfare pioneered during the human Cold War. The Archons fought to prove their biological superiority. Humans, Leo realized with a cold, terrifying clarity, fought to entirely erase their enemies from existence. His first step was solidifying his power base. The 404th Infantry Battalion, once a dumping ground for the Empire's disgraced exiles, had returned to Prime as hardened, fanatical veterans. They had watched a frail, flesh-bound alien outmaneuver a mechanized army, and in him, they found a living god of war. The Ministry of Defense is already drawing up the paperwork to disband us, Leo told Sergeant Kale late one evening. They were gathered in the subterranean, damp barracks of Sector 7. Around them stood the core of Leo's new command structure. Corporal Miller, a sniper who had lost his honor badge for striking an officer, and Specialist Harrison, a demolitions expert with a cybernetic arm. Kale, his single amber eye glowing in the dim, flickering lumen light, slowly sharpened his heavy combat blade. Sterling's lackeys will try to reassign us to the Outer Rim fleets. They want to dilute the blood of the 404th. They fear the anomaly you represent. What are your orders, Commander? I am not your commander, KL, Leo said softly, sliding a heavily encrypted datapad across the rusted metal table. I am the architect of their obsolescence. You are going to help me build a ghost army. Under Leo's direction, the 404th discarded their heavy, honorable chitin alloy armor. Leo outfitted them in human-designed stealth gear, matte black, non-reflective synthetic weaves that absorbed thermal signatures. He trained them in human asymmetric warfare, night raids, silent takedowns, and improvised explosive devices. Then Leo unleashed them. He began an aggressive, invisible campaign of logistical terror aimed directly at Minister Sterling's private military-industrial complex. Using the deep state access codes he had ripped from the Synthetica theater commander, Leo orchestrated a series of devastating, pinpoint strikes. It started as a trickle of anomalies. 2 massive freighters, heavily loaded with refined plasma cores destined for Sterling's personal dreadnought fleet, suffered spontaneous navigation glitches. They dropped out of hyperspace directly into the heart of hostile Krieger pirate territory and were instantly boarded and stripped. Then, the violence escalated. Leo personally led Kale and Miller on a Black Ops raid against an automated munitions factory on the moon of Tartarus. They didn't fire a single shot. Instead, Leo bypassed the security grid and manually inverted the facility's atmospheric pressure regulators. The resulting implosion was catastrophic, wiping out a quarter of Sterling's heavy artillery reserves in a silent, fiery flash. Because Leo perfectly mimicked Synthetica electronic warfare signatures, Archon intelligence universally blamed the cybernetic collective. Panic gripped the ministry. In his high-rise office, Minister Sterling screamed at his chief of security, Director Cromwell, demanding answers as his personal wealth and political leverage bled dry. Desperate to protect his remaining assets, Sterling diverted his elite Praetorian Guard off-world, leaving him politically and physically exposed on Prime. With Sterling's defenses weakened, Leo finally confronted the man who had raised him. Commander Garrison was standing in his private, vaulted study, gazing out through the reinforced glass at the smog-choked, sprawling skyline of Prime. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, the electronic deadbolts sliding into place with a definitive thud. Garrison turned slowly to find his adoptive son standing in the shadows, clad entirely in black tactical gear. Leo's face was a mask of cold, terrifying calm. "You bypassed my biometric security," Garrison noted, his voice a low, rumbling vibration that rattled the crystal decanters on his desk. "A very dangerous game, Leo. Even for the celebrated hero of Oakhaven. I know what happened to the Bradbury father," Leo stated. There was no tremor of sorrow in his voice, no surge of human emotional distress. It was a statement of absolute, lethal fact. Garrison stiffened, his massive, armored shoulders tensing instinctively. The Krieger pirate raid. Winston documented the wreckage himself. "Winston lied to protect his career, and you lied to protect yourself," Leo said, stepping into the dim light. From his wrist projector, he cast a holographic playback onto the stone wall. It was a heavily encrypted tactical log from an Archon heavy cruiser, dated 18 Earth years ago. It showed the Bradbury drifting peacefully in the void before a high-yield plasma torpedo, a signature Archon weapon, ripped through its primary habitation ring, instantly vaporizing hundreds of sleeping humans. "Minister Sterling authorized the strike," Leo continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "It was a live-fire test on an unarmed, civilian colony ship. My parents were incinerated because of an arrogant bureaucrat's target practice, and you knew. You claimed the right of spoils to hide the evidence of a war crime." Garrison stared at the glowing blue hologram, then at the boy he had raised from a fragile, shivering infant. The Archon commander did not reach for his sidearm. Slowly, the fight drained from his imposing frame, and he lowered his heavy head. "I found you in the wreckage, Leo. I looked into the pod and saw a creature that absolutely refused to die," Garrison said, his voice thick with a strange alien regret. "If I had revealed Sterling's crime, the High Council would have erased you, me, and my entire bloodline to maintain the illusion of political unity. I kept you alive. You built me into a weapon," Leo corrected him, his eyes locking onto Garrison's. "And for that, I am genuinely grateful. You gave me the tools to survive the crushing weight of Prime. But now, I am using those tools to burn Sterling's legacy to ash. I am going to tear the Ministry of Defense apart from the inside out. I only have one question for you, Garrison. Will you stand in my way?" The Archon commander looked deep into the dark human eyes of his adopted son. He saw the cold, calculated apex predator he had unwittingly nurtured. Archon honor strictly demanded he arrest Leo for treason right then and there. But Garrison was a tired soldier who had spent a lifetime bleeding for corrupt, cowardly politicians. "Sterling is a rot upon the Empire," Garrison rumbled, stepping forward and placing a heavy, metallic hand on Leo's shoulder. "Show me the human art of war, my son." The trap was sprung during the Festival of the Ascendant, a planetary holiday where the entire High Council, including Minister Sterling, gathered in the Grand Senate of Prime. Sterling, desperate to regain political favor after the catastrophic logistical failures of the past months, had orchestrated a massive military parade, pulling the capital's defense fleets into low-orbit formation for a visual spectacle. It was the exact tactical blunder Leo had anticipated. While the sky was filled with ceremonial cruisers, the subterranean levels of the Senate were dead quiet. Senator Gallagher, a staunch ally of Sterling, had just authorized a lockdown of the lower tiers to ensure security. But Gallagher didn't know that the security grid had been rewritten by a human. Leo, clad in a sleek, non-reflective tactical suit woven from synthetic carbon fibers, moved through the ventilation shafts like a phantom. Behind him were 30 of the 404th's deadliest operators, including KL. They didn't wear the clunky, honorable armor of the Archon military. They wore human-designed stealth gear, painted matte black. They had abandoned honor for efficiency. In the Grand Senate chamber above, Minister Sterling was in the middle of a booming, arrogant speech about the unbreakable might of the Archon species, deflecting blame for the recent supply chain disasters. "We are the masters of Sector 4, Sterling roared to the cheering crowd of aristocrats. "No alien sickness, no cybernetic plague can pierce our armor." Suddenly, the grand holographic banners suspended above the Senate floor flickered and died. The massive, golden blast doors of the chamber locked with a deafening thud. The ambient lighting shifted to a harsh, blood-red emergency glow. A single transmission hijacked the Senate's audio feed. It wasn't an Archon dialect. It was a recorded broadcast translated perfectly from a human philosopher named J. Robert Oppenheimer, dug up from the Bradbury's archives. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Before Sterling could order his elite guard to investigate, the marble floor in the center of the chamber shattered. Plasma charges, perfectly placed on the structural support pillars of the level below, detonated in complete unison. Smoke and pulverized stone filled the air. Out of the dust, moving with a speed and silent synchronization that terrified the Archon elite, emerged the 404th. They didn't shout war cries. They simply raised suppressed kinetic rifles, custom-built by Leo to fire depleted uranium slugs that ignored energy shields and shattered chitinous armor, and opened fire. The Praetorian Guard, heavily armored but slow and reliant on ceremonial plasma halberds, were slaughtered before they could close the distance. The human-designed kinetic rounds ripped through their exoskeletons like paper. In 60 seconds, the military backbone of the Senate was broken. When the dust settled, Leo stood at the center of the room. He held a high-caliber kinetic revolver, its barrel smoking. Minister Sterling, bleeding from shrapnel wounds but alive, crawled backward up the steps of the podium. His arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by primitive biological terror. He looked at the soft, flesh-bound creature advancing upon him. "You." Sterling choked out, recognizing the boy he had tried to execute years ago. "You are an aberration. You are Garrison's pet. This is treason. The fleet will glass this building." "The fleet," Leo said, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the chamber, "is currently locked out of its own navigational computers. I uploaded a synthetic logic bomb into the orbital relay network an hour ago. They are drifting, blind, and deaf in low orbit." Leo ascended the steps. Every eye in the High Council was fixed upon him. They were watching a paradigm shift. They were watching the apex predator take the throne. 18 years ago, you authorized the destruction of the USG Bradbury, Leo said, stopping at the foot of the podium. "You murdered 1,000 innocents for a weapons test. You thought humans were soft. You thought we were prey." Sterling sneered, trying to salvage his pride. "You are flesh. You break. You bleed. I am Archon." With a desperate, roaring lunge, Sterling activated a hidden kinetic shield generator on his wrist and lunged at Leo with a concealed dagger. To the Archons watching, Sterling moved fast. But Leo was running on human adrenaline. Time seemed to dilate. Leo didn't try to block the dagger. His flesh would lose to the metal. Instead, he stepped into the attack, utilizing a human martial arts technique, Aikido redirecting the massive Archon's momentum. Leo grabbed Sterling's wrist, twisting it with violent torque against the joint's natural articulation. The heavy armor worked against Sterling, locking his arm in place. With a sickening crack, Leo broke the minister's arm. As Sterling fell to his knees, bellowing in agony, Leo pressed the barrel of his kinetic revolver directly against the thin plating at the base of Sterling's skull. "We do bleed," Leo whispered, loud enough for the council to hear. "But humanity's greatest strength is that we never forget who made us bleed, and we make sure they never do it again." Leo pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening. Sterling's massive body slumped to the floor, lifeless. The High Council sat in stunned, terrified silence. According to the Codex of Strife, Leo had just challenged the highest authority and won. By their own brutal laws, he was the victor. Commander Garrison stepped out from the shadows of the gallery, walking slowly down to the Senate floor. He looked at the dead minister, and then at his adopted son. Garrison dropped to one knee. bowing his massive armored head. "The right of conquest is invoked," Garrison declared, his voice carrying the weight of the military behind it. Slowly, one by one, the surviving members of the Praetorian Guard dropped their weapons and knelt. Then, the High Council, terrified of the ghost army and the ruthless, unarmored creature before them, followed suit. Leo did not smile. He looked out over the kneeling forms of the most powerful species in Sector 4. They hadn't adopted a pet. They had imported a conqueror. Under Leo's command, the Archon Empire did not fall into ruin. It evolved. He discarded their rigid, archaic honor codes and reformed their military using human strategic doctrine. He introduced them to psychological warfare, black ops sabotage, and ruthless, asymmetric combat. When the Synthetica invasion eventually pushed into the core systems, they didn't meet honorable, predictable Archon warriors. They met a mechanized, highly adaptive war machine orchestrated by a human mind. Leo never took the title of Emperor. He remained the Shadow Minister, operating from the darkness, a perpetual reminder to the galaxy that the most dangerous weapon in the universe doesn't have claws, fangs, or armor. It has soft skin, dark eyes, and a terrifying capacity for calculated malice. The galaxy learned the hard way: never, under any circumstances, wake a sleeping human. What an absolute thrill ride. From a fragile toddler trapped in the frozen wreckage of space to the ruthless shadow ruler of the galaxy's most fearsome empire, Leo's journey proves one universal truth. Humanity's ultimate weapon isn't our physical strength. It's our sheer, unbreakable will and our terrifying adaptability. The Archons thought they were raising a fragile anomaly, but instead, they accidentally forged the very architect of their own evolution. It just goes to show, never underestimate the wrath of a human with a score to settle and the patience to see it through. If you loved this deep dive into HFY sci-fi drama and want to hear more epic tales of humanity defying the odds across the cosmos, smash that like button, share this story with your fellow sci-fi enthusiasts, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next intergalactic adventure. Let me know in the comments below, what human military tactic would you use to outsmart an alien empire? See you in the next video.
Hi, my name is Tran Trung, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, a lost human child was found by aliens. They accidentally raised the galaxy's most dangerous leader, _HFY sci-fi. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What really stood out to me was the mix of survival, loneliness, and quiet determination running through Leo's story. Even though this is fiction, it still says something interesting about how people are shaped by the world around them. Leo grew up feeling different everywhere he went, and that pushed him to become stronger in ways nobody expected. There's something both impressive and a little unsettling about that kind of transformation. I also think the story reminds us that intelligence and patience can be more dangerous than raw power. Do you think Leo became a hero, or did revenge slowly turn him into something colder? And if you were raised in a completely different culture, how much of yourself do you think would still remain the same? Thanks for spending some time with Palace Truths today. If this story gave you something to think about, feel free to leave a comment and maybe like or subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories in the future.